When I arrived in London, the air felt heavy and cold. It was my first time leaving Bangladesh, and everything around me seemed too big, too fast, and too strange. I stood at the airport, holding my husband's hand, but I did not feel close to him. His name was Karim. We had been married for only a few months before he brought me here. My mother told me I was lucky. She said Karim had a good job in England and that I would live a comfortable life. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that I was starting a new life, one filled with safety and love. But from the first night in London, I knew that my life here would be quiet and small. Our home was a small flat on the 4th floor of a gray building. The windows looked out onto another wall, and the only light came through a small gap between two buildings. I spent my first morning cleaning the kitchen and waiting for Karim to return from work. I tried to cook the dishes I knew, but I could not find the same spices or the same vegetables. Everything smelled different. Even the rice did not taste like the rice from home. I missed my mother's voice and the sound of the street outside our old house. Here, there was only the noise of cars and the wind that came through the window cracks. In the first few weeks, I did not speak much. I did not know many English words, and I was afraid of saying them wrong. Karim told me I did not need to go out because London was dangerous. He said I should stay home, cook, clean, and wait for him. So I did. My days passed slowly. I listened to the sounds of footsteps on the stairs, the voices from the television in the flat below, and the clock that ticked too loudly in our kitchen. Sometimes I stood by the window and looked down at the street. Women walked by with open hair, laughing and talking freely. I envied them. They looked like they belonged here. I felt invisible. After some time, I learned to walk to the small shop on the corner to buy bread and milk. The shopkeeper was kind and spoke slowly so I could understand. When I went there, I felt alive for a few minutes. I began to recognize faces in the neighborhood, but no one knew mine. I was Karim's wife, the quiet one who did not talk much. He liked it that way. When I tried to speak about my feelings, he told me not to complain. He said I should be thankful. I knew he worked hard, and I tried to be a good wife, but inside, I felt like a shadow. Time passed, and I gave birth to 2 daughters. My first daughter, Aisha, was quiet like me. My second, Lena, was louder and more confident. They were born in London and spoke English better than Bengali. Sometimes when I listened to them, I felt both proud and afraid. I wanted them to belong, but I did not want them to forget who they were. Karim said children needed to be strong and modern, but his way of being modern meant forgetting the past. He wanted me to wear Western clothes and go out more, but when I did, he became angry. He said people would talk if his wife walked around too much. I did not understand what he wanted from me. When the girls went to school, the house became quiet again. I started to sew clothes for women in the neighborhood. It gave me a little money and a little respect. Some of the women came from Pakistan, others from India or Somalia. They all had their own stories of moving to this country. We spoke about our families, about the cold weather, about missing our mothers. For the first time, I felt I was not alone. But Karim did not like me having friends. He said women who talked too much caused trouble. I told him I was sewing to help with money, but he did not listen. One afternoon, a letter came for me. It was from my sister, who still lived in Dhaka. Her handwriting was the same as when we were young. She wrote about our mother's health, about the village, about the new market. I read the letter again and again. Then I looked around my flat and felt a wave of sadness. I realized how far away I was. My sister was living the life I used to dream about. Simple, warm, and full of family. I was in a cold room in London, sewing clothes for other women, trying to be thankful. Years went by like this. Karim grew heavier and slower, and his dreams of business success never happened. He became angry more often, not because of me, but because life did not turn out as he planned. I became more silent. Silence became my protection. When I was quiet, there were fewer arguments. When I was quiet, he believed everything was fine, but inside, I started to change. I was no longer the young woman who waited for others to decide her life. I started to think about my own wishes, my own voice. Sometimes I walked with my daughters to the park. I watched them laugh and run. They were free in ways I never was. They spoke about their friends, their school, their dreams. Lena wanted to become a designer, and Aisha wanted to study medicine. I smiled and nodded, even when I did not understand all their English words. They did not see the quiet tears that sometimes filled my eyes. I was proud, but I was also afraid that I would be left behind in their world. One evening, Karim told me he wanted to return to Bangladesh. He said England had changed, that people here no longer respected traditional families. He said we should go back and live a peaceful life. For a moment, I felt a small hope that maybe things would get better. But then I thought about my daughters. They were born here. Their lives, their friends, their dreams were here. How could I ask them to leave everything behind? That night, I could not sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the years that had passed in silence. All the things I wanted to say, but never did. I realized that the biggest distance in my life was not between Bangladesh and England. It was between who I was and who I wanted to be. The next morning, I stood by the window and looked outside. The same street, the same gray buildings, but something inside me felt different. I did not know what would happen next, but I knew that silence could not protect me forever. I had to find my own voice. Before I continue with this story, please like, subscribe, share, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Your support means a lot. Now, let's continue. After that morning, I started to notice small changes inside me. They were not loud or sudden. They came quietly, like soft rain that you only hear when you listen carefully. I began to see that silence had been my safety for many years, but it also kept me invisible. I had lived my life behind other people's voices. My husband's voice, my daughter's voices, even my mother's voice from far away. I wanted to hear my own. One day, while sewing a dress for a woman who lived downstairs, she told me that a community center nearby was offering free English classes for women. I felt my heart jump. The idea frightened me. I had never gone anywhere alone. But I could not stop thinking about it. That night, I looked at the small mirror above the sink. My face looked older, my skin tired, but my eyes still had light. I wanted to use that light for something. The next morning, when Karim went to work, I put on my long coat, took the bus for the first time, and went to the community center. The building was small but full of noise and warmth. There were women from many countries there. Some wore scarves, some did not. Some spoke English better than I did, and some were quiet, like me. The teacher smiled and asked my name. I said it softly, afraid I would say it wrong. She smiled again and said, "Welcome, you are here now." For the first time in a long time, someone said those words to me. Learning English felt like learning how to breathe again. Every new word felt like a step forward. I practiced how to say, "I am" and "I feel." They were simple words, but they gave me strength. I started to write short sentences in a small notebook. I am in London. I feel lonely. I want to learn. I carried that notebook everywhere. When I cooked, when I waited for the bus, when I went to the shop, I repeated the words in my head. It was not about speaking to others. It was about hearing myself. After a few months, I began to help other women in the class who could not read well. I showed them how to write letters and fill in forms. The teacher said I was patient and kind. Nobody had called me that for years. Karim noticed that I left home more often, but I told him I was visiting a friend. I was afraid to tell him the truth. If he knew, he might stop me. But inside, I knew I was doing something right. I was becoming more than a wife who waited. As my English improved, I started to understand more of what my daughters said. They were growing fast. Aisha talked about university. Lena wanted to design clothes and have her own shop one day. I told her that sewing was a skill that could open doors. She laughed and said she wanted to make new styles, not old ones. I smiled because I liked her courage. She did not know that her courage gave me courage too. At the community center, I met a woman named Farah. She was from Pakistan and had lived in London for many years. She spoke softly but had a strong spirit. We sat together during lunch breaks, and she told me about her life. She worked part-time in a bakery and said it helped her feel free. I told her I had never worked outside the home. She said, "You could. You have skills. You sew better than most people." Her words stayed in my mind for days. The idea of working outside felt strange, but it also felt like sunlight on my skin. One afternoon, Farah asked if I could make a dress for her cousin. I agreed. When her cousin came and saw the finished dress, she smiled and said it was perfect. She paid me with a small envelope of money and asked if I could make another one. Soon, I had more women coming to me for clothes. My hands were busy again, but now my heart was too. I was doing something that was mine. It was quiet work, but it made me proud. It was the first time in my life that I earned my own money. When Karim noticed the extra money in the drawer, he asked where it came from. I told him I was helping women in the building with small sewing jobs. He said nothing, but his face showed that he was not happy. He said people might talk. I told him it was honest work. That night, he did not eat dinner. I sat at the table and watched the food grow cold. I was afraid of his silence, but this time I did not apologize. I knew I had done nothing wrong. Months passed, and Karim's health began to change. He often came home tired and angry. He said his job was difficult and his body ached. I cared for him as best as I could, but his anger grew like smoke in the room. One night, he shouted that England had ruined everything, that we should have stayed in Bangladesh. I listened quietly, but my heart was full. I wanted to tell him that I had tried to make this life work. I wanted to tell him that I had been silent for too long. But I said nothing. I waited until he went to bed, then I sat alone in the kitchen and looked at my notebook. The first sentence I had written was still there. I am in London. I added another line under it. I am not lost anymore. Around that time, the community center asked me if I would like to help teach the new class of beginners. I could not believe they wanted me. I told them I was not a teacher, but they said they needed someone who understood what it felt like to start from absolute zero. I agreed, and the first day I stood in front of the group, my hands shook a little. But when I saw the faces of women who looked as afraid as I once did, I felt calm. I told them my name, where I came from, and why I was learning. Their smiles gave me strength. Teaching gave my days meaning. I still cooked and cleaned, but those things no longer defined me. I was not only Karim's wife, I was a woman who could help others find their voice. Each evening I came home tired but full of quiet joy. The house no longer felt like a cage. It was still small, still gray, but inside me there was space. My daughters saw the change too. Aisha said I looked happier. Lena said I looked different. I did not tell them why, but I think they understood. One day, Karim's friend came to visit. He talked for a long time about life in Bangladesh and said that many people there were returning home after years in England. Karim seemed excited by the idea again. After the man left, he told me we would move back soon. He said it was final. I looked at him and felt something rise inside me. It was not anger, it was strength. I said softly, "You can go if you want, but I will stay here with our daughters." He stared at me as if he had not heard correctly. I had never spoken to him like that before. I felt my hands shake, but I did not look away. That night, I lay in bed and listened to the city outside. The cars, the wind, the soft hum of life. It all felt different. London was no longer a strange place. It was the place where I found my voice. I knew Karim would not change easily, but I also knew that I had already changed. I was no longer afraid of silence because now it had a meaning. It was not emptiness anymore. It was peace. After that night, everything inside me felt calm, even though the world around me did not change. Karim still spoke little to me, but the silence no longer frightened me. It was not the same kind of silence that had trapped me years ago. This silence was mine. It came with strength. It meant that I could decide what to say and when to speak. I did not need permission to feel or to think anymore. A few weeks passed before Karim brought up the subject again. He told me he was serious about returning to Bangladesh. He said life in England was too expensive and too lonely. I listened quietly. Then I said that our daughters belonged here now. I said they should finish their studies and choose their own lives. He looked at me for a long time and said that I had changed. I said nothing, but I knew he was right. I had changed in every way that mattered. When Karim began to make plans for his return, I felt both relief and sadness. He was not a bad man, but he was a man who lived by rules that no longer fit my life. I could see that he was tired and disappointed with the years he had lost. He still wanted to be respected, but he no longer knew how to live in a world that had moved forward. I respected his wish to go home, but I knew that home for me had changed. My home was no longer a place, it was a state of being. It was peace inside my own mind. My daughters were old enough to understand what was happening. When I told them that their father wanted to return to Bangladesh, Aisha looked serious, but Lena began to cry. They both said they wanted to stay. Aisha said she would work part-time while studying to help with expenses. I told them not to worry. I would manage. I did not yet know how, but I believed I could. That belief alone felt new and strong. On the day Karim left, the sky was pale and cold. He packed 2 suitcases and moved slowly around the flat. We did not argue. There were no big words, no final promises. He said he might come back later if things became better. I said I wished him peace. When the door closed behind him, I stood still for a long time. The flat was quiet, but the quiet did not hurt. It was the sound of a new beginning. The first few weeks without him were strange. I had never lived alone with my daughters before. Every decision was mine now. The bills, the food, the small repairs around the house. It was not easy. There were moments when I felt afraid, especially at night when the city lights faded and the room was still. But every time fear came, I reminded myself that I had already survived years of silence. I knew how to live with difficulty, and I knew how to keep going. I continued to teach at the community center. My students were women from different parts of the world, and their stories reminded me that every woman carries a world inside her. One had escaped war. Another was raising her children alone. We all had different paths, but the same desire: to be seen, to be heard, and to live with dignity. I often told them that learning English was not only about words, it was about finding courage. I think they understood. At home, my daughters filled the rooms with noise and life. Aisha worked hard and studied late into the night. Lena filled the house with music and laughter. Sometimes they argued with each other, but those arguments were full of love. I watched them grow into young women who spoke their minds without fear. I wanted them to know that being silent should never be the price of peace. As months turned into a year, I began to take more sewing work from the community. Some shops in the area wanted small designs, and I helped with those orders. I worked late but did not feel tired. The sound of the sewing machine was like a heartbeat in my home. It reminded me of how far I had come. Once, I had sewn clothes for others to survive. Now I did it to build my own future. One afternoon, while I was teaching, a woman from the council office came to visit our class. She spoke about small business support for women. I listened carefully. That night, I told my daughters that I wanted to start my own sewing business. They were excited. Aisha helped me fill in the forms, and Lena made a small sign for our living room window that said, "Alterations and Design by Nadia." Seeing my name written like that made me smile. It was a name I had almost forgotten I owned. The first customer came 2 days later, then another. Word spread quietly, and soon I had enough work to keep me busy every day. I was not earning much, but I was earning something honest, something that came from my own hands. It gave me more than money. It gave me self-respect. Every stitch I made felt like a small declaration. I am here, I exist, I have value. Sometimes I received letters from Karim. They were short and formal. He wrote about the weather in Dhaka, about distant relatives, about people I barely remembered. He said life there was slower, simpler. He said he missed us but understood why we stayed. I wrote back politely. I wished him good health. There was no anger, no regret, only a quiet understanding that our lives had moved in different directions. As years went on, the city around me began to feel like home in a new way. I no longer looked at it as a place that had taken something from me. It was a place that had given me myself. When I walked to the market, I no longer felt small or lost. I smiled at neighbors, I spoke in English without fear, and I even laughed with the shopkeepers. My daughters teased me and said I sounded like a Londoner now. I laughed too, because in a way, it was true. One evening, when the house was quiet and both girls were out, I sat by the window and thought about the life I had lived. I remembered the girl who arrived here so many years ago, afraid to speak, afraid to live. She had believed that being silent was the same as being safe. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her that silence does not protect you. It hides you. It keeps you small. It stops you from seeing how strong you can be. I had learned that strength does not always look like shouting or fighting. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is a simple word spoken after years of being silent. The next morning, I went to the community center early. The hall was empty and still. I opened the classroom windows and let the cold air come in. It felt fresh, like the start of something new. When my students arrived, I told them that I wanted to begin each lesson with a sentence they could use in their lives. That day, I wrote on the board, "I can choose." I told them that these 3 words were the most powerful ones I had ever learned. One of the women asked me why, and I said because they remind me that even in the smallest moments, we all have choices. We can choose silence, or we can choose to speak. We can choose fear, or we can choose hope. The class was quiet for a moment, and then they began to repeat the words aloud. I can choose. Hearing them say it made me feel proud. Years later, when both my daughters moved out to begin their own lives, the house became quiet again. But this time, the quiet felt full. It held memories, laughter, and love. I looked at their photos on the wall and smiled. Aisha was working in a hospital, and Lena had opened her small design shop. They both thanked me for believing in them, but I knew that they had given me more than I had given them. They had shown me that love and freedom can exist together. Sometimes I still write in my old notebook. The first line I ever wrote is still there in faded ink. I am in London. Under it, I once added, I am not lost anymore. And recently, I added one more line. I am free. That sentence means everything to me. It reminds me that my life was not silent at all. It was full of quiet lessons, small acts of courage, and the slow, steady discovery of who I am. I used to think that love meant giving everything to others. Now I know that real love begins when you learn to give something back to yourself. So when I close my eyes at night and listen to the city around me, I no longer feel like a stranger. I feel like a woman who found her voice in the middle of all that noise. I feel like someone who has finally come home. If you liked my story, please like, comment, and share.